Welcome to Houston Sports Talk with your host, Robert Land.
Thanks for checking into the best Houston sports podcast, part of the National Bleav Network, presented by FanDuel. And you Rockets fans are going to love this one. You're about to hear a fun conversation with the author of a new Moses Malone biography. Had a blast reading this, and I flew through it in just a couple of days. Trust me, Rockets fans, you're going to find it fascinating. Couple of Houston sports notes before we get there. A fond farewell to Astros World Series hero Chas McCormick. The Astros outrighted Chas. He's headed to free agency. No surprise. That catch at the wall in the 22 World Series goes down as the most memorable catch in Astros history. No doubt. There are plenty, you could say, that are better, but none quite as memorable as that one. Hard to believe how he just fell off a cliff offensively the last couple of seasons. His OPS in the 22 and 23 seasons, a combined 793, nearly an 800 OPS. You'd love to have that guy in the lineup the last couple of years, but no, his OPS since then, 574. But hey, you couldn't ask more from a player the Astros drafted in the 21st round. So nice going for Chas, and his Astros career will never be forgotten. In another no surprise, the Astros outrighted Luis Garcia. His career, along with Jose Urquidy's career, ended thanks to the World Baseball Classic. That's my opinion, but hey, both of those guys injured less than a month later, and they've never recovered. That short ramp up right after a season that went to the World Series in November, the latest the season has ever gone, basically blew out both guys. The WC back in this March, and you can pray that Astros pitchers and pitchers around the league might make note of this before they get into that. Garcia, another incredible find by the Astros, taken in the international draft in 2017, and 71 games, 65 starts for the Astros in the regular season. Garcia had a 3.60 ERA, a 1.146 WHIP. He only pitched 2 postseason games in that 22 championship season, but one of them was the unforgettable bullpen stint in the 18-inning classic in Seattle. Both Chas and Garcia, so likable. I know all Astros fans wish them nothing but the best and hope they can get back to what they were. Both Chas and Garcia, so likable. You got to wish them and hope for them nothing but the best, that they can get back to where they were earlier in their careers. The Astros also put Ronel Blanco, Zach DeCenzo, Caleb Ort, Brandon Walter, and Hayden Wesneski back in the 40-man. You'd assume DeCenzo and Ort would be ready for spring training. Blanco, Walter, and Wesneski, very doubtful. Probably not going to see those guys till July at the earliest with their arm injuries. And a quick Texans note also, Titus Howard, Ed Ingram, and Jalen Pitre all likely out for the Jags game. Throw in Kaimi Fairbairn, who is definitely out. So I'm surprised the Texans are a 1.5-point underdog on FanDuel, only 1.5, even though it's a home game with Stroud out and the best part of the O-line. It's hard to believe the Texans can win. I would have had the Jags by 3, so I would kind of go ahead and take them in this one. I think the Jags will at least have this one by a field goal. You hope not, but come on, this is going to be tough to get. The over-under 37.5. How did the Texans score? How did the Jags get more than 20 at NRG against that defense? So I'd keep taking the Texans under. I go back to that one more time. Keep going back to the well to these guys figure it out. It's too depressing to talk Texans, so let's ditch that chatter. Go old school Rockets and hear from a wonderful guest. You're going to love it. We welcome in the author of a new Moses Malone biography, Paul Knepper, who wrote Moses Malone, The Life of a Basketball Prophet. Great to have you, Paul. And I was so excited when you first told me you were shining a light on such a key figure in Rockets history. What made you want to write this? Had there been other Moses biographies?
There had not, and I'm glad you asked that because I think the seed was planted maybe 10, 12 years ago. I consider myself a historian of the game, and I know a great deal about most of the game's greats, and I knew relatively nothing about Moses. And it's probably 10, 12 years ago, I went on Amazon. I was like, I'm going to buy a book about Moses and learn more about him. And there was no book about Moses, to my surprise. And it wasn't until many years later that I decided to do it. But I think that planted the seed because, as you know well, as a Houston guy, he had an extraordinary career. He was the first modern player to go straight from high school to pros. He's one of only 9 guys to win 3 or more NBA MVP awards. He was the best player on one of the greatest teams ever, the 82-83 76ers. Statistically, he's by far the greatest offensive rebounder ever. And nobody talks about Moses anymore. When people talk about the all-time greats, his name never comes up anymore. I wanted to do my part to kind of correct that narrative and be like, hey, everybody, there was this great player named Moses Malone, and these were the things that he did.
Yeah, we talked to Hakeem Biographer, Mirren Fader last year, and he was kind of a mystery. He feels like a little underrated at times, and it's almost symbiotic that within a year, you both tackle the life of Rocket centers who didn't say much, were understated, humble by most accounts, and slipped under the radar at times in NBA history. And in Moses' case, even in Rockets history, I think to some effect. And not to mention, Moses was Hakeem's mentor. So there's that connection. But Paul, why was he such a mysterious figure? Why was Moses? And remind everybody how Moses was actually portrayed in his heyday and maybe why that mystery was there.
Yeah, I think there's a few reasons why Moses is kind of forgotten. And I think one is there was no flash to Moses. None. He didn't soar to the basket like Dr. J, or he wasn't a wizard with the ball like Magic Johnson. He didn't even have a signature move or shot like Olajuwon's Dream Shake or Kareem's Skyhook. Moses' greatest skill was offensive rebounding. His greatest attribute was his work ethic. And I don't think SportsCenter was leading off highlight reels with Moses Malone rebounding, or younger generations of fans are pulling up YouTube clips of Moses rebounding the way they might other great players. Another reason I think he's forgotten somewhat or not known as much about is Moses played for 9 teams across 2 leagues over his career at a time when most superstars spent their majority of their career or their whole career with one team. And so he's not as associated with any one place as a lot of other stars. When you talk about Houston specifically, I think in the 70s, when he got there, Houston was still just kind of finding its footing as a basketball town, certainly on the professional level. It was very much, as you know, very much a football city. They had like no crowds when he got there. I think if he'd come along in Houston now, it would be somewhat different. But the last reason, probably the biggest reason, is Moses didn't give a damn what people thought about him or whether people were talking about him or not. He had no interest in fame. He had no interest in being a superstar. He was very gruff with the media. I think he was shy. He was an introvert. He didn't like talking about himself. He was self-conscious about his speech impediment. And so he didn't really engage with the media. I think that has really affected the way he's remembered, the way he was viewed then and the way he's remembered now. He played at a time when there was no social media then, right? There was no internet. For a lot of his career, cable television hadn't even taken off. It was the sports writers who created the mythology around our athletes then. And I talked to a lot of sports writers who covered him, and they all say, we didn't know the guy. We didn't know him at all. And some of them flat out disliked him. And so I think that's really affected the way he was talked about and covered then and the way he's remembered now.
Yeah, the story that you shared in the book that really personified that attitude towards publicity was when a Philadelphia reporter asked him for an interview. He said, talk to somebody else. The reporter said, but the story's about you, Moses. The people in Philadelphia don't know much about you. And Moses said, well, I was in Houston for 6 years. They don't know me there either. I like it that way. And, Paul, what may surprise most was that he was a prankster. Do you have a favorite Moses prank from the book?
Yeah, he was a prankster. Robert, that was the best part, was finding out, because he didn't let you in. He didn't let the media in. He didn't let the fans in. So it was really interesting to learn what he was like as a person away from the cameras. And he was a prankster. And a lot of it was just, it was juvenile pranks, like hiding a guy's jersey or leaving the player's sneakers on the bus or something like that. One funny one he did, I think it was Franklin Edwards told me, who he played with the 76ers. Moses used to call people up. So he'd call Franklin Edwards up and pretend to be Andrew Toney. And he'd say, hey, Franklin's Andrew, let's get dinner. Meet me at this restaurant at 8:00 or whatever. And Franklin would go meet him. And of course, Andrew Toney wasn't there. Andrew Toney didn't even know about it. It was just Moses playing a prank. So yeah, he was a real jokester.
He is 9th all-time in points, 3rd in rebounds, 2 MVPs with the Rockets. You mentioned 3 overall, 1 with the Sixers. Not to mention, he had this perfect alliterative name with a biblical flair to it. And as your book title says, Paul, he was a basketball prophet. And as you can say, he led players out of the shackles of needing college basketball. I mean, I guess that's his Moses-like quality. He's the first one to jump from high school straight to the pros, as you mentioned earlier. But Paul, it's really fitting that Moses stuck a rather prophetic note in his Bible while he was in high school. Tell that story. That's incredible.
Yeah, I love that. And there are a number of reasons why I came up with the basketball prophet. You name one. Of course, there's the natural allusion to the biblical Moses, but the notes. It was 2 different notes. It was the first one. He was 14 years old. He wrote on a piece of paper that he was going to be the best high school player in the country his junior year in high school, and stuck it in the family Bible. And it was just a crazy prediction at the time because he'd only been playing basketball for a few months. He wasn't very, very skilled at all. There wasn't very much talent or great coaching around him in Petersburg, Virginia. His parents weren't very tall. There was no reason in the world to believe that he would blossom into that player. But he did. After his junior in high school, when he'd fulfilled that first prophecy, he wrote another note tucked in the Bible saying he was going to be the first player to go straight from high school to pros. And again, that seemed extremely far-fetched at the time, but also came to fruition.
Yeah, and then he signs with the ABA Utah Stars out of high school, but I don't think that's anywhere near as fun as the crazy lengths that college coaches went to try to sign him. Can you give us a couple of stories of just the outright insanity that was going on in Petersburg and around Malone at that time?
It was really crazy and really unseemly, I thought, just the way that they pursued him to the point that he used to lie down in the floor in his mother's home so that people didn't know he was home and couldn't see him. I mean, the best one has to be Oral Roberts. Oral Roberts came to visit him and his mother. Mrs. Malone she was a frail woman. She had an ulcer, and Oral Roberts told Mary Malone that he would heal her ulcer if Moses came to Oral Roberts University. Which is, that's just crazy stuff. But even just, like the coach of New Mexico came down and lived in Petersburg. He lived in Howard Johnson in Petersburg from March until like June, just living there in the hotel. And people were just camped out there. It was really crazy the lengths that coaches went to get him to come to their school.
If he signs with Maryland, which by all accounts, it looks like that would have been the one that he would have gone with. He plays with future Rockets point guard John Lucas, who of course was his teammate his first couple of years in Houston. And Lucas was very involved in that recruiting process, right?
Yeah, he was. Lucas, I think the coaches kind of pushed him to get involved, the Maryland coaches, because I think it was only about 2 hours. Petersburg was only about 2 hours from College Park. And then Lucas saw him play in like a high school all-star game. And it was like, whoa, okay, I need to get this guy on campus. So he did. Lucas many times went down to Petersburg and he played some pickup ball with Moses in Petersburg. And Moses actually did commit to Maryland. As the story goes, Lucas, on the first day of Moses went up there the summer before his freshman year. On the first day of classes, Lucas wakes Moses up to go to class, and Moses said, "I'm going pro," and that was it.
Wow. And then from the Utah Stars, which he starts off with, he spends his second pro season with the Spirits of St. Louis in the ABA. And I know people that follow the ESPN 30 for 30 docs saw the doc that they did on that team. Bob Costas called the games, but the Rockets fans might not realize that Moses was teammates on that team with Mike D'Antoni, Don Chaney, and Caldwell Jones, 2 future Rocket coaches. And of course, Caldwell ends up coming to the Rockets as the compensation for Moses in '82 when Moses signs with the Sixers. We'll get to that later, but Paul, you explained that Moses is like a member of the famous Jones family with Caldwell and Major, 4 NBA players all together in that family. He was close with that whole family, right?
Yeah, very close. It started with Caldwell, as you noted. I think Caldwell it was a crazy situation when the Spirits of St. Louis, and there was kind of the Marvin Barnes, and some people followed him and down to bad places. But Caldwell was a professional, and he kind of took Moses under his wing that limited time that he was there, and they stayed in touch and stayed close. And then he became very close with Major in Houston when those guys played together. And he and Major were like best friends until Moses died. And then Moses played with a third Jones brother whose name is eluding me right now, but they played together in Washington with the Bullets. I mean, the Jones boys are a great story themselves. There were 6 of them played college basketball at the same school in Albany, New York, and 4 of them played pro ball. And Moses was, when he would go to Jones family events and reunions and funerals, and they would refer to him as Moses Malone Jones.
Oh yeah. That was really interesting to hear. Really fun to hear, as somebody that grew up a Rockets fan remembers those guys. And you mentioned in the book that elite skill, offensive rebounding. We talked about his rebounding prowess, which may have been slightly underappreciated in the pre-analytics era, but your book comes out at the perfect time for Rockets fans who've gained a whole new appreciation in the Steven Adams era for the offensive rebound. What made Moses a gifted rebounder in general, Paul? Because for those who don't know, number 1 all time in offensive rebounds, but not just number 1. It's an incredible 2,500 more than second place Artis Gilmore.
Yeah, there's a stat I love. The distance between Moses and number 1 and Artis Gilmore at number 2 is the same as the distance between Artis Gilmore at number 2 and I think it's Vin Baker at like number 79. That's how far Moses is ahead of the pack.
Wow.
And, obviously Moses had some tremendous physical gifts. He was very quick on his feet. He was a quick jumper. He had an incredible ability to, kind of like Dennis Rodman, to jump and come down and reach up again faster than anybody else. He had remarkable instincts. People talked about how it seemed like there were like magnets in his hands and the balls were just drawn to him. But it was actually that he had an incredible instinct as to what kind of angle the ball was going to come off the rim. But, everybody that I talked to kept coming back to the same thing, which was just desire. That very simply, Moses wanted the ball more than everyone else and was willing to do anything to get it. He seemed to be indefatigable. They just, as the game wore on, his opponents would get tired and he would just keep coming and coming and coming. Del Harris, who of course coached him in Houston, he told me, he said basically, I don't know that Moses was that much of a better rebounder than anyone else. He said he just went for every damn rebound, always. Whereas a lot of great rebounders, they'll go for 30, 40 rebounds a game. Moses will go for 120 rebounds a game. He goes for every rebound like his life depends on it. And I think ultimately that was the biggest factor.
Yeah, people thought, oh, Moses isn't that bright, but he was in the film room studying the guys and studying their shots too, right? I mean, he really looked at it from all different angles on how he could get better at that.
Yeah, and that, we talked about the sense of humor. That was another thing that really I think people don't know about Moses and was very interesting to learn about how intelligent he was. To win 3 NBA MVP awards, you have to have a very high basketball IQ. You just have to. That's got to be part of the equation. But yeah, he studied like long before now film work is so common, but long before guys did a lot of film work, Moses did a ton of film work, and he would break down his opponents and his teammates to get a better understanding of every teammate. He had an idea of when Calvin Murphy misses, how he typically misses and where the ball is likely to come. And he knew that for Rudy Tomjanovich and Mike Newland and on for all the guys. I remember talking to Sidney Moncrief, who played with Moses late in their careers for a season, and him telling me that Moses was elite at processing information. And a lot of that was through film work, but just understanding of the game, understanding where he should be on the court. Moses always knew where all of his teammates should be at every time, on every play, in every situation, and sometimes would yell out to them where to be. Again, those are the kind of things that I think fans just didn't know because Moses didn't let you in. Yeah,
I remember you talked in the book a little bit about that, how guys would come in at the end of the games and Moses would have notes for them on everything that had happened, and they didn't realize like Moses was keeping track of all this stuff. And we talk about his offensive rebounding. First MVP season with the Rockets, he set an offensive rebound record. It still stands today. Before we move on, hey, do any of you viewers or listeners look back at old Moses highlights, or did you see him in person? Let me know in the YouTube comments your thoughts on this show and Moses, and go to our Rockets Memories playlist. Find our conversation with the Athletics Mirror and Fader on her Hakeem bio, plus our tribute to Rockets iconic voice Gene Peterson. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube with notifications so you can get updates on the live shows and all of our content. Also subscribe on your favorite podcast app. All right, Paul, after the ABA experience, Moses nearly becomes part of a Twin Towers in Portland. And I should have known this, but I did not. Several years before we even knew of Sampson and Elijah and the real Twin Towers, you had this story that I'm not sure people know about in Portland.
Yeah, it's great. It's great. Moses moved around so much his first couple of years before he really found a home in Houston. And so when the ABA folded, or they had the merger, whatever you want to call it, 4 of the ABA teams jumped to the NBA, and the players from the remaining teams were put in a dispersal draft where teams had to pay a fee and then they could draft them. And so he was drafted by the Portland Trailblazers. The problem was the Blazers also drafted Maurice Lucas, who was a very good player, and they had Bill Walton. They planned on starting Walton and Lucas, and they felt like Moses had a really high salary, and this was 1976, and they didn't want to pay a lot of money for a guy who was going to come off the bench. And so Moses spent all a training camp with Portland. It was a thrill to talk to Bill Walton about that. And then right at the end of training camp, they traded to the Buffalo Braves, who had him for a week. That's another what if, because the Braves had, at that point, for 1 week, they had a front court of Bob McAdoo, Moses Malone, and Adrian Dantley. And that all fell apart. After a week, they traded him to the Rockets, which was another whole crazy situation. But it's certainly a big what if in Portland because, first of all, what could Moses and Walton have done together? And then, of course, the Blazers won the championship that year. But then the year after, the foot problems started for Moses. And so I talked to some guys like that, like Lionel Hollins, who was on that team, said, if we would have kept Moses, maybe we win another championship or two even after Walton goes down because we just kind of plug Moses in there. Walton and Moses were very different players, very great in their own ways, but it's certainly a great what if to think about what could have happened if Moses had stayed in Portland.
Yeah, so he comes to Houston, and because the ABA failed, the Rockets get a gift. And Paul, did the ABA's failure and Moses' arrival save the Rockets franchise?
I don't think it's a stretch to say that. The Rockets, when he got there, the Rockets were in receivership. Their owner had basically gone bankrupt and couldn't pay the team. And they were in tremendous danger of being taken over by the league. There was talk of them possibly relocating. I think that was a real possibility because the attendance was very low. They didn't have an owner in place. And then you bring in Moses, and that year they made the conference finals his first year there. And they kind of built from there. And I think they started to build more of a fan base and more of a following. And who's to say? Who knows what would have happened if Moses didn't show up? But it's certainly possible that they could have ended up somewhere else.
In the era of load management, people got to remember that Moses averaged over 40 minutes per game his 4 seasons in Houston, bookended by those 2 MVP seasons. When the Rockets beat the Lakers in round 1 of their 81 final season, Moses played in all but 2 minutes of the 3-game series. In round 2, they played the Spurs on their way to the finals. And Paul, this sums up what Malone was all about. What was he wearing around his neck when he walked on the court for game 3?
Oh, the boxing glove. He was wearing boxing gloves. Those Spurs teams are known as the Bruise Brothers. They had a lot of big bangers, big bruisers, and Moses was not afraid of the challenge, of the physicality. He grew up playing on the playground. He grew up playing, and when he was high school, he used to go to the local prison, and he would play pickup ball with the inmates in prison. So Moses wasn't afraid of a fight. I've heard people refer to him as the lunch pail superstar or the blue collar superstar. Certainly that image of him with boxing gloves around his neck fits the bill.
So let's get to the exciting part. The Rockets go to the finals behind Moses. Unfortunately, they lose that 81 finals to Bird Celtics, but not because of Moses. He averaged 22 points, 16 rebounds, and 45 minutes per game. He's also remembered for his infamous quote in that series that fired up the Celtics. And Paul, I want to get your take on it. But first, let's hear Rockets legendary beat writer Robert Falkoff, who covered Moses, tell the story on our show a few years ago.
In the finals, after it was 2-2, nobody will ever really remember whether this was said in jest or exactly how it came about. But in order to fire up his team, he had a quote, I could take 4 guys off the streets of Petersburg, Virginia, which was his hometown. I could take 4 guys off the streets of Petersburg, Virginia, and beat the Celtics. And Bill Fitch was the Celtics coach at the time. He was known for scanning the newspapers at length to try to find bulletin board material. And so it didn't take long long for that quote to get into the yellow highlighter category. That was up on the Celtics bulletin board when they got back to Boston for Game 5. And Boston was pretty fired up. They blew out the Rockets in 5, and then they ended up coming back to Houston winning Game 6. But, as Moses said, hey, I was just trying to fire my guys up and make them believe we could go win.
Great stuff from Falcoff. Paul, you could find that conversation, by the way, on our Rockets Memories playlist on YouTube. Paul, what did you find out about that famous quote?
Yeah, some people had different takes on that. I talked to Robert Reed about that a lot, but he rest in peace. Robert felt that Moses was kind of fed up because, as you recall, that Rockets team was 40-42. They were below 500. They made the finals, and so everybody kind of wrote them off. Nobody thought they had a chance against the Celtics, especially back east. The Eastern writers and reporters. And Robert said he and all their teammates were just really tired of hearing how great the Celtics were and how the Rockets had no chance. And Moses just kind of said what was on his mind. His Rockets teammates didn't particularly like it. Tom Henderson, I remember talking to him saying that, you don't poke the bear. I remember Major talking about that. A lot of the guys I talked to about that, and they weren't thrilled that he said it, but they were all kind of like, Moses is our guy and we're going to roll with him. We got his back and we're going to get after it. But I always think it's funny because Moses was known, we talked about how he didn't talk to media and he was so quiet and gruff and everything. But he had two of just the all-time great quotes, that being one, and then fo with the 76ers. So I just think it's funny that a guy who's known for not talking is remembered for these great quotes.
Oh, yeah. And then he wins his second MVP in 82 with the Rockets. He's only 26. So what in the world happened there, Paul? How does he even get to free agency that offseason? How the Rockets lose a 26-year-old two-time MVP who was the franchise?
So going back, I think it was about 2 years earlier, Moses wanted to stay in Houston very much. Houston was home. I feel like he kind of grew up in Houston, and after he wandered around so much early in his career, he finally found some stability there. And by that point, he had a kid there and his wife, and they lived there, and he had other family there, and he was comfortable. He never wanted to leave. I think it was almost 2 years earlier, they had a deal in place, or as his agent told me, it was very, very close to a deal with the Rockets owner, George Maloof. And then George died suddenly of a heart attack. His son, Gavin, took over, and Gavin was only 24 years old. And the family, there was a lot of discrepancy in the family as to what to do with the team. Should we sell the team? Should we hold on to it? And really, the Moses extension talks were put on hold kind of indefinitely. And they never really made him a great offer prior to free agency. Finally, at like the 24th hour, 12th hour, whatever the expression is, they came to him like a few days before free agency and made him an offer. And at that point, it was like, well, I'm going to test free agency at this point. It's in a few days, So it was a weird time in the NBA. It seemed like there was collusion between the owners. The restricted free agency had just started, and there was no salary cap yet, and salaries were skyrocketing. And so the owners were trying to keep down salaries. But it only took one owner to step up and make a big offer, and Harold Katz did that with the 76ers. He offered him, it was a little over $12 million for 6 years. Oh, by the way, about right around the day that Moses hit free agency, the Maloof sold the team to Charlie Thomas. It was a different day, man. Charlie Thomas was a car salesman. He owned the car dealerships, which seemed to be a common thing among owners then. He wasn't like he wasn't Steve Ballmer. He wasn't a tech billionaire. So Ray Patterson goes to Charlie Thomas and says, Charlie, we got to match this offer, because the Rockets had a chance to match. He was a restricted free agent. He said, we got to match this offer. Moses is everything to this team. And Charlie said to Ray, I just paid $12 million for the whole team. I can't pay that for one player. And that was the end of the discussion. On the 76ers side, there was some back and forth as to whether they should try and offer the Rockets a trade, because the Rockets publicly said they were going to match the offer, but they were bluffing. I think they were bluffing. But Harold Katz was concerned that maybe they would match the offer. He also thought it wasn't great for the league if he signed away the reigning MVP winner from a new owner like that. And so Harold Katz and the 76ers engaged the Rockets in discussion to make it a trade instead of a straight free agent signing. And they ended up getting Caldwell Jones and a first-round draft pick in exchange for Moses. But that's how he left. He really didn't want to. All things being equal, he would have gladly stayed in Houston. But it was a significant difference in money.
Yeah, and he goes on. He wins the championship in Philadelphia that next year. The second MVP brings Dr. J his first championship, and that was just kind of a Cinderella season. But I'm going to go back to his childhood just for a second, though, because people might not believe this, but Moses was teased. He's picked on as a kid. His nickname was Teeny. It was a rough kind of childhood for him, his neighborhood and everything, right?
It was very rough. He was extremely poor. I had a lot of coaches say some variation of the same thing to me, but I think it was Joe Harrington, who was assistant coach at Maryland, put it most succinctly. He said, Paul, I've recruited kids all over the country. I've seen all kinds of poverty. I've never seen poverty like the Malones. And he didn't have a father, and he didn't have any siblings. It was a rough neighborhood. It was a segregated neighborhood. So he lived in Petersburg, Virginia. He grew up. He was born in 1955. Until the mid 60s, Petersburg was still segregated, racially segregated. There were a lot of obstacles and distractions in front of him that he had to overcome. And yes, he was teased. I think he was kind of gawky. He was very skinny and very tall. And he had a speech impediment, which, when you're a kid, other kids can be cruel with that kind of thing. It was not an easy path for Moses, but he had very strong character, and he persevered.
Yeah, did pick up basketball till he was 13. And when you look at it, it's like, oh, the older kids were laughing at him. Didn't pick up basketball till late. They threw the ball at him, hit him in the chest. And as I read all that, I'm thinking, oh, that's probably why he was so helpful and patient with the young Hakeem, who picked up basketball at a later age like he did, who was, probably getting a little bit of the business, being in a new country and being different and all that. And of course, Rockets fans know how much he helped Hakeem develop in Dream's college days when he worked with him at Fondy Rec. But as you point out, it wasn't just Hakeem that he mentored. I mean, we all know about that here, but he mentored a bunch of NBA players, one of those being Charles Barkley. And Paul, Barkley called Moses the greatest influence in his career, like you said in the book.
Yeah, Moses, he really did enjoy being a mentor. And Hakeem and Barkley are the most notable for sure. But there are guys I talked to who never even made the league, who played professionally in Europe, or guys who were, bench players in the league, or just had a cup of coffee in the league. And Moses looked out for them. He took them under his wing. He and Barkley had a very special relationship. Barkley, as you noted, just said he was the most important person in his career. I mean, the big thing is Barkley always says Moses taught him to work hard. But it is interesting because there was a soft spot to Moses. There was actually you would never know it based on how hard he played, but he had a gentle side to him. And I think he could be empathetic to others, and supportive of them when they were struggling. The great Barkley story, of course, is Charles was fat and out of shape when he got in the league, and his rookie year early on, he wasn't playing very much, at least not as much as he wanted to. And Billy Cunningham, the coach, was getting on him a lot. And Charles went to talk to Moses, and he told him all this. Is like, why am I not playing? And Moses looked him up and down and said, "You're fat and lazy." Which is just so typical Moses, just blunt and, to the point. But Moses worked with him. He worked with him. He said lose 10 pounds, and Charles did. He said lose 10 more pounds, and Charles did. And Moses worked with him before practice and after practice. They ran at the track. And Charles was one of the few people to deliver a eulogy at Moses' funeral. So they had a really special relationship.
Yeah, when they traded Moses, it hurt Barkley so much that Barkley said, mentally, it screwed me up a great deal for some time. I lost another father figure, someone who was more important to me than anyone in my life other than my mother and grandmother. Barkley thought trading away Moses from Philly was the beginning of the end of his Philadelphia career. He said Moses was one of the nicest people that he ever played with, one of the few people, Barkley said, I know making $2 million a year who isn't a jerk. And Paul, you write how incredibly loyal Moses was just as a friend, like how he stood by Calvin Murphy. We all kind of know the story about Calvin Murphy here in Houston, but he really stood by him too.
Yeah, he was I think, a wonderful teammate. Moses had his flaws. He had his flaws. He certainly issues with his marriage. There were real problems there, but he was a very loyal person. He loved being a teammate. I think it's part of the reason, Moses really stuck around a long time after his prime, because I think he just loved playing basketball and he loved being with the guys and being a teammate. he remained a loyal friend to many. You talk to former athletes, and most of them, they have maybe 2-3 guys that they stay in touch with from their playing days. Moses, it was like dozens, teammates, opponents, tons and tons of guys who he spoke to fairly regularly. They all say he would do anything for them. The example of Calvin's a great one. But guys, lesser players. I mean, Paul McKeskey, who we played with a little while in Houston, was he would call Moses and be like, "Hey, Moses, I'm doing a golf tournament." Moses was like, "Tell me when and where. I'll be there." Like, no questions asked. And so he was a good friend and loyal, I guess is the word. He was very loyal.
Yeah, Murphy, of course, went through all of his stuff, and Moses was always by his side. There was another teammate of his you talked about that, he had jail time, and he came in there after he got out of jail and was visiting him every year and bringing him stuff, and just never left that guy's side when a lot of people would have. 99% of Moses' stories are positive, but as you just referenced, there's some pretty dark allegations by his wife. How difficult was it to put that against all the rest of the stories that you heard about his generosity and kindness?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked about that. That was really hard for me as a writer. It was hard to wrap my head around. It was hard to write about because they're pretty gruesome allegations by his wife. And this isn't some random woman. This is his wife, who was married to for 10 years and is the mother of 2 of his children. And so it was hard because it's an unpleasant subject, right? I didn't enjoy researching about it. I didn't enjoy writing about it. But it was also like, how do you square this with the man that everything else we've talked about, with what a wonderful friend he is and what a supportive teammate he is and stuff like that. And I want to say, first of all, I don't know for sure if any of the allegations are true, but there is some compelling evidence. And I think Moses just might have had this side to him that many people didn't see or, didn't come out often. He was a complicated man. There were different layers to him, and he certainly made his mistakes and had his flaws. And 2 things could be true. He could have been a terrible husband in certain ways, but also a supportive teammate and friend. Yeah.
And you said he stayed in touch with his ex-wife and they still had some sort of relationship. It wasn't, totally separate after the divorce back in 1991. Of course, he didn't pass away until about a decade ago. You also mentioned in the book, it shocked me that I guess his son, he's got a son that's later in life that's only 16 now, 16 years of age. This was like 2009, right, Micah?
Yeah. Micah's 16 now. It's terrible, It's particularly heartbreaking to me. I remember because Micah's mother is a lovely woman named Leah. She and Moses weren't married, but they were in a relationship and a long-term one when Moses died. And yeah, talking about her, I remember talking to her about, what it was like for Micah was only 6 years old when Moses died. And my son was 6 years old when we had that conversation. And it was emotional for me. It's sad that Micah has grown up without his father.
Well, there's so much fun behind the scenes stuff with Moses in the book, whether you talk about him riding a Harley at motorcycle rallies or mentoring Destiny's Child. It's all this stuff. I'm like, what? He did what? It's a fun read for any Rockets fan, Sixers fan, NBA fan, whatever. Tons of stories in it. We barely touched the surface. Just want to thank you so much for all the amazing research, Paul. Let everybody know where the book is available.
Yeah, well, first, thank you so much, Robert, for reading the book and for having me on here. It's a pleasure talking to you. I know your Rockets, your Houston sports history. So it was a pleasure talking to you. You can find the book. It's in bookstores. It's on Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, through my publisher, University of Nebraska Press, all the normal spots.
Before we go, I just want to thank our friends at FanDuel, FanDuel.com, the place to go. And thank you again, Paul, for both the time and also sharing stories with us about the big man who saved the Rockets franchise. That's what he did, and it's a great story.
Thanks, Robert.
You're listening to Houston Sports Talk.
Hey, don't forget to support us by subscribing and commenting on YouTube. You can always listen to us on Spotify, Apple, or your favorite podcast app. Tell your friends about us and share our show links on social media. Spread the word, everybody. Thanks for listening.